It's ironic to think that grown-ups need to be told that locking up innocent children is likely to cause them harm. And we've been around that circle several times in the last 15 years or so in Australia. And every psychiatrist in the country will tell you that locking up innocent people harms them. But we keep on doing it.
Yeah.
And we keep on being surprised when the Human Rights Commission reports that it's harming them.
I think you're right. There's no surprise that mandatory and indefinite detention causes people harm. I think at the moment with the physical conditions on Nauru and Manus, there are real problems. They're dangerous places. They're unsafe places. People are suffering assaults and injuries. The other factor, though, is the indeterminacy of it, that people don't know if or when it'll ever end.
And you're in the rare position of having been to Manus, I think, 3 times.
Yeah.
So what did you notice in the development of people's attitude, demeanour, state of health, etc., from the first to the second to the third visit?
The first time I went to Manus was just after the riots in which Reza Barati was killed. And I walked through the detention centre as part of a court case, and it was incredibly tense. There was a lot of angst. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of tension. Security presence was really overwhelming, shockingly overcrowded. In one room, there were 120 bunk beds, 240 beds in this one old aeroplane hangar from the Second World War. The atmosphere was desperately tense. When I went back most recently, this is 2.5 years later, it actually wasn't the tension that really slapped me in the face when I arrived. It was the exhaustion. These men were so tired. After 3 years on a painful road to nowhere, they were completely exhausted. I think it's a system that is designed to pressure people to give up and return home. And I mean, the government often talks about voluntary returns, but it's like if someone's put between a rock and a hard place and they choose the rock, it's hardly a voluntary decision. These guys have seen a friend beaten to death. They've seen another friend die after a cut on his foot was infected and turned septic. They've seen other friends beaten by people our government pays to protect them. They've spent 3 years languishing in this environment. If going home was an option for them, they would have done it ages ago. The reality is they're still there stuck because they've got no choice. These are guys who've fled danger. They need a chance to rebuild their lives in safety, and that's what our government needs to get down to giving them.
There's a number of people in Australia who were born here to women who had come as boat people and then sent over to Nauru, but brought back here for the birth of their child. And the government legislated retrospectively, didn't it, to declare those babies to be boat people, in effect.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary situation, really. And, you know, it'd almost be funny classifying a kid who was born here as a boat arrival if it didn't have such serious consequences. Because you've got to remember, when you are a boat arrival under Australian law, you are subject to potential indefinite detention and potential removal to Nauru.
Well, where do you think this is all leading? All of these retrospective laws, laws designed to deprive people of the most basic rights, where's it all going to end up?
I think the clear legal trend here is that Australian law is being completely stripped of checks and balances. I think that's really concerning because, you know, governments all over the world have to deal with difficult policy challenges, but they have to do so within certain limits. You know, there are basic minimum standards of humane treatment that governments shouldn't breach. Yet on the refugee and asylum seeker issue in Australia, what we see time and time again is, rather than respecting basic limits of humane treatment, the government just removes them from our law. Just removes them from our law. And I think that's deeply concerning.
And especially if the Parliament is willing to set aside fundamental ideas about decent conduct in relation to one group, who's to guarantee that they won't do it in relation to some other group at some other time if it suits them politically?
Yeah.
You know, Today it's boat people, tomorrow it's Muslims, the next day it's Jews, the next day it's...
You know, we're incredibly lucky to be born in the country that we're born in, but the reality is not everyone here is so lucky, and there are serious human rights violations. We often talk about how these policies harm people seeking asylum. What we often overlook is how they also harm us. When you have governments that strip our laws of basic checks and balances, exclude the power of the courts to review profoundly important decisions about people's lives, undermine democracy by having incredibly draconian secrecy laws, those things, they don't just affect people seeking asylum, they undermine the very fabric of democracy and rule of law in this country, and that affects us all.